Hello, I'm John Wiles, and today I'm in the Brussels offices of Red Flag, a relatively young consultancy founded in Dublin 4 years ago. Towards the end of last year, Red Flag produced a report called Closing Doors, which you can find on the wonk.eu website, based on a survey that they conducted over a period of 2 or 3 months among corporate representatives, industry and sectoral representatives, and policymakers on the question of access to policymakers and trends in access. The headline conclusion of the report was that something like 6 out of 10 of the respondents expected the access to policymakers to diminish in time. I'm talking to Séamus Conboy, who is Red Flag's Director of Campaigning and EU Affairs. And Séamus, you say in the report that when your company was founded, you expected the atmosphere around access to policymakers to change quite rapidly in Europe. And indeed, you thought it was changing rapidly.
Thanks, John. Yes, I think when Red Flag was founded in 2013, it was at a time of considerable change in Brussels and in EU policy making. It was in the immediate aftermath of the economic crash. It was at a time of growing hostility to corporate influence. We were seeing a rise of populist politicians, and we were seeing a push towards greater transparency as well. And it's in that context that the thousands of lobbyists who are engaging with the institutions in Brussels and trying to make their case are working every day. So in the summer of 2016, we set out to investigate this phenomenon and to learn from the policymakers themselves what it is that their perceptions are. So over the course of a couple of months, as you've said, we set out to interview some of Brussels' top lobbyists. We interviewed 35 people in total, and the findings that we got from their experiences were very, very interesting. We found that over half of the lobbyists that we interviewed had been refused a meeting because of the industry or because of the company which they represent. We found that 62% of our participants feared that their access to politicians would get worse. And indeed, on a 10-year horizon, we asked people, do you think your access will be better, worse, or the same in 10 years' time? Nearly half expected that their access would be worse, while a very optimistic 8% believed that they would actually have better access in 10 years than they do now.
Sorry, can I interrupt? If that is the trend, how worried should we be?
Well, it's quite interesting because what we were trying to do was assess how worried the lobbyists are. And what we found was that they were near unanimous that the restriction of their access would be very detrimental to their business and to their activities. So we saw 96% believed that it would be detrimental to their business. More than half believe that a restriction of access is going to come about, and yet just 1 in 4 actually have plans in place or have factored this into their risk analysis. So it's clear that people have identified this as a problem, think that it's realistic, but aren't necessarily taking the necessary steps to address it.
And is there any connection being made between, as it were, the rise of populism in Europe and this problem of access? In other words, the reputation attached, if you like, to big corporates and their lobbying activities?
I think our research doesn't show a direct cause and effect, but it's quite impossible to consider the two issues in isolation from each other. On the one hand, you've got populist politicians who are making huge gains in polls and electorally through railing against the establishment, against government, against big business, against banks, and against the cosy relationships that exist between them. On the other hand, you've got the establishment politicians, the traditional parties who are trying to understand this new momentum. They're trying to understand what's motivating their voters. And they're doing this at a time when there's greater public access to politicians, where politicians are relying on social media from time to time to actually sample public opinion. And we have to consider the implications of this, because one thing that is quite apparent from political campaigning and from issues in Brussels over the past number of years is that NGOs and activists have adapted to this new populist reality, to the social media sphere, far, far better than industry has.
And did you come across any examples of NGO success in, as it were, getting doors closed against lobbyists?
But I think when we look at the issue of access to politicians, what we see is that tobacco is considered the gold standard. And our research showed, when we asked when we asked the industry representatives, what are the industries that you've actually witnessed exclusion taking place in? Pharmaceuticals and tobacco were the two that were constantly referenced. In the case of tobacco, there's a UN framework convention, and the FCTC, which contains a provision which says that public policy should be protected from the vested interest of the tobacco industry, and this is used or interpreted by some people to mean that the industry should be excluded from the policy making process. This has clearly been seen by people in other industries and by NGOs as a playbook potentially for other industries. So we've seen the WHO representative to the EU last year calling for similar provisions to be introduced for sugar, for fast foods, and for alcohol. And we've also seen, in the case of the oil and gas sector, a petition of 300,000 people being submitted calling for the industry to be excluded from the COP21 and COP22 negotiations. Alcohol is another example where we've seen efforts being made to exclude the industry. So we've seen that the EU's Health and Alcohol Forum, which brings together policymakers, industry and NGOs, it hasn't met for quite some time now because the NGOs have withdrawn from participation. And we've also seen when national representations hold meetings about alcohol policy that the alcohol industry's requests to participate are not being accepted.
Yes. The industry formally and publicly declares itself in favour of the transparency regulations now that they work under and have done for several years. Do they actually, though, feel that these transparency regulations are working against their interests in the end, particularly in being required to declare their budgets for lobbying?
I think that the trend is very clearly towards a greater transparency, and even at the moment in Brussels we're discussing a new interinstitutional agreement, the extension of the provisions of the transparency register, and even making it mandatory where it's now voluntary. And I think there can be no doubting that that's a good thing, that it's very important in terms of restoring and maintaining the public's confidence in the policy-making process. The issue arises where the good faith declarations made by industry and other lobby groups are being used as a stick to beat them, and this is something that arose in our research, where activist groups and others produce league tables of people who have the most meetings, people who spend the most money, in an effort to actually exclude them from having greater access. Now, as a campaigning tactic, I have to say it's quite a clever one. It's much easier to win an argument if there's only one side to the argument, and I think some of the activist groups will be well aware of this. But we also have to consider carefully the potential consequences. If a politician wants to meet with an industry or a company, but is concerned that a declaration of that meeting would cause them problems, we have a very real risk that meetings like this could actually be forced underground. And that would go against all of the intentions of the transparency measures, and it's something that needs to be avoided.
And as a communications consultancy, have you developed, as it were, strategies and strategic ideas for confronting this problem?
Well, I think, at a time, as we've outlined, where access is slowly being restricted, I don't think we're going to see the doors being shut straight away to industry lobbyists, but we are certainly seeing a trend towards the restriction of access, and the industry representatives are, in our research, told us exactly that. What I think the industry must begin to do, and it's something that we always recommend, is that they need to look at other channels to make their case, whether it's through the media, whether it's through adapting to the new social media environment. I think that's absolutely essential for them.
Fine. Thank you very much, Séamus.
Thank you.